Welcome to today's journey into the most revolutionary moment in human history. A transformation so profound that it still shapes every aspect of your life today. Right now, as you watch this, you're re-experiencing the legacy of a decision made over 6,000 years ago by people who dared to imagine something that had never existed before: the city. Picture this. The year is approximately 4500 BCE in southern Mesopotamia. Along the banks of the Euphrates River, a settlement is growing beyond anything the world has ever seen. Mud brick buildings rise 3, 4, even 5 stories high. Thousands of people crowd into streets barely wide enough for 2 donkeys to pass. The air fills with sounds never heard before in human history: the rhythmic pounding of coppersmiths, the shouts of merchants hawking exotic goods from distant lands, the prayers of priests ascending from massive temple platforms that dwarf everything around them. This is Uruk, and it is becoming the world's first true city. But here's the mystery that should captivate us. Why? For roughly 290,000 years, humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, following game, gathering wild plants. Then, in what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink, we completely transformed our existence. We built cities. We created kings and priests, soldiers and slaves, merchants and artisans. We invented writing, law, mathematics, and literature. We constructed buildings that would still be standing 5,000 years later. How did the ancient Mesopotamians accomplish this staggering feat? What drove them to abandon the freedom of nomadic life for the crowded, disease-ridden, hierarchical world of the city? What technological breakthroughs made urban life possible in a harsh, unpredictable environment? And what can the story of humanity's first cities tell us about the urban world we inhabit today, where more than half of all humans now live in cities that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors? Chapter 1. The land between 2 rivers. The sun rises over a landscape that looks nothing like the desert you might imagine when you think of ancient Iraq. The year is approximately 10,000 BCE, and the region that will become known as Mesopotamia, literally, the land between the rivers, is a complex mosaic of environments. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers snake through terrain that shifts from mountains in the north to marshlands in the south, creating a ribbon of fertility through otherwise arid lands. This is not an easy place to live, but it is a place of extraordinary potential. The rivers flood unpredictably, sometimes with devastating force, sometimes failing to rise enough to water the fields. Unlike the Nile, which floods with reliable annual rhythms, the Mesopotamian rivers are temperamental, dangerous, and demand constant human attention. Yet these very challenges will force the innovations that make civilization possible. Small groups of hunter-gatherers move through this landscape, following patterns established over thousands of years. They track gazelles and wild cattle, harvest stands of wild wheat and barley that grow in dense patches near water sources, and collect the eggs of waterfowl in the extensive marshes. Life is mobile, flexible, and relatively egalitarian. Leadership is temporary, based on skill and situation rather than permanent hierarchy. There are no kings here, no temples, no written laws. Yet the seeds of revolutionary change are already being planted, literally and figuratively. Around 9500 BCE, some of these groups make a decision that will echo through millennia. In the northern reaches of Mesopotamia and the surrounding Fertile Crescent, people begin to stay in one place for longer periods. The first permanent structures appear simple round houses dug partially into the earth, with walls of packed mud and roofs of reeds and branches. These aren't cities or even villages by later standards, but they represent a fundamental shift in human thinking. For the first time, people are investing labor in places rather than remaining ready to move at a moment's notice. The transition to agriculture happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. People who have been harvesting wild grains for thousands of years begin to notice patterns. Seeds dropped near camp sprout the following season. Protecting these accidental gardens from animals and competing plants yields more food. The most productive plants get saved and replanted. Over centuries, wild wheats and barleys are transformed through selective breeding into domestic crops with larger seeds that don't scatter in the wind. Plants that require human intervention to reproduce. This is domestication, and it creates a new kind of dependency. Humans need these plants, but these plants also need humans. It's a partnership that will reshape the world. Animals undergo similar transformations. Wild sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle are gradually brought under human control. The process takes generations, selecting for docility, manageable size, and useful characteristics like wool production or milk yield. By 7000 BCE, fully domestic animals are widespread across Mesopotamia, providing not just meat, but ongoing resources, milk, wool, leather, and perhaps most importantly, labor power and fertilizer for fields. But here's what makes Mesopotamia special: the challenge of the rivers. In the northern regions, where rainfall is more reliable, early farming communities can depend somewhat on rain-fed agriculture. But the true potential of the land lies in the south, in the hot, dry plains where the rivers spread into countless channels before reaching the Persian Gulf. This region, later called Sumer, receives almost no rainfall during the growing season. Farming here is impossible without irrigation. The earliest irrigation systems are simple small channels dug from streams to nearby fields, perhaps some basic levees to control flooding. But they represent a profound shift in human organization. Building even simple irrigation works requires coordination among multiple families or groups. Water must be shared, disputes resolved, maintenance coordinated. The very act of manipulating water to serve human needs creates new forms of social complexity. By 6000 BCE, settlements in southern Mesopotamia are growing larger and more permanent. The village of Eridu, which will later claim to be the world's first city, is established near the marshes where the rivers approach the sea. It starts small, perhaps a few hundred people living in mud brick houses clustered around a simple shrine. But it is strategically located where multiple resources converge: fresh water, fish, date palms, and clay for pottery and construction. Trade routes connecting the resource-rich northern regions with the Persian Gulf pass through here. The mud brick house becomes the standard Mesopotamian building form, and it's worth understanding why. Stone is scarce in southern Mesopotamia, but the rivers provide endless supplies of mud and clay. Weeds from the marshes can be bundled for structural support. The technique is elegant in its simplicity. Mix mud with chopped straw. Press it into wooden molds. Dry the bricks in the sun, then stack them with more mud as mortar. The resulting structures are surprisingly durable in the dry climate, though they require constant maintenance and replastering. This building material, literally the earth itself, will be the foundation of the world's first cities. As settlements grow, social differentiation begins to emerge. Some families have better land, more animals, more stored grain. The concept of private property develops alongside agriculture because fields and stored resources are different from wild game. They can be owned, controlled, defended. Leadership becomes more formalized. Some individuals or families gain authority through religious charisma, military prowess, skill in dispute resolution, or simply through accumulated wealth. The egalitarian world of the hunter-gatherer band is gradually giving way to something more complex and hierarchical. Religious life intensifies and becomes more elaborate. The simple shrines of early villages evolve into more substantial temple structures. Eridu's temple is rebuilt and expanded over centuries, each new version built on the ruins of the old, creating an artificial hill that lifts the sacred space above the mundane world. This pattern, the temple on its platform, will become iconic in Mesopotamian architecture. The temples aren't just places of worship. They're economic centers where surplus grain is stored, where religious specialists manage resources, where the community's wealth accumulates under divine protection. By 5000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia is dotted with substantial villages and towns. Populations range from a few hundred to a few thousand people. Irrigation systems are becoming more sophisticated, with networks of canals allowing cultivation of areas far from the riverbanks. The basic technologies and social structures that will enable true cities are in place. But the transformation from town to city, from complex village to urban civilization, is still ahead. That transformation will require new innovations in technology, organization, and human imagination. The stage is set. The rivers flow through their ancient channels, bringing life-giving water and unpredictable floods. The people have learned to cultivate the land, to build permanent structures, to store surplus, and to coordinate their labor. The temple platforms rise above the settlements, marking these places as special as chosen by the gods. Everything is ready for the next great leap forward, the moment when these towns will explode in size and complexity to become something entirely new in human experience: the city. Chapter 2: The Uruk Revolution. The transformation begins around 4500 BCE in the settlement that will give its name to an entire era: Uruk. What happens here over the next 1,000 years is so dramatic, so unprecedented, that archaeologists call it the Uruk period. And they speak of the Uruk Revolution with the same reverence that later historians reserve for the Industrial Revolution. This is the moment when the city is invented, and nothing in human life will ever be the same. Uruk sits in the heart of southern Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates River splits into multiple channels before reaching the sea. The location is strategic, close enough to the marshes for fish and waterfowl, near date palm groves, with good irrigation potential and access to trade routes. But hundreds of other settlements have similar advantages. What makes Uruk different is scale. Around 4000 BCE, the settlement begins to grow at an explosive rate that defies everything known about previous human communities. The numbers tell a stunning story. In 4500 BCE, Uruk is a large town of perhaps 2,000 people. By 3500 BCE, it has grown to perhaps 10,000. By 3000 BCE, it houses between 40 and 50,000 people, covering an area of nearly 250 hectares. To put this in perspective, Uruk is now larger than most cities in medieval Europe would be 3,000 years later. Nothing like it has ever existed before. The world's first city has arrived. But how? What makes it possible for tens of thousands of people to live together in close proximity, when humanity has spent its entire existence in small, mobile bands? The answers lie in a constellation of innovations that emerge in Uruk and spread throughout Mesopotamia, innovations that we still rely on today. The first requirement is food, and lots of it. A city of 50,000 people cannot feed itself. The surrounding countryside must produce enough surplus to support not just farmers, but a whole population of specialists who never touch a plow: priests, administrators, craftsmen, merchants, soldiers. This requires agricultural intensification on an unprecedented scale. The irrigation systems expand dramatically, with major canals stretching for kilometers, connecting to networks of smaller channels that can water vast areas. Farmers develop new techniques: crop rotation, intensive fertilization with animal manure, systematic weeding, and pest control. The plow comes into widespread use, pulled by oxen, allowing one farmer to cultivate much more land than possible with hand tools. The surplus grain flows into the city, particularly into the massive temple complexes that dominate Uruk's landscape. The main temple precinct, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, grows into something that defies description. The temple platform rises in stages to a height of over 12 meters, approached by monumental staircases. The temple buildings themselves are enormous, with walls decorated with elaborate patterns created by inserting thousands of colored clay cones into the mud brick, a technique that creates stunning geometric mosaics. The labor required to build these structures is staggering. Archaeologists estimate that the main temple platform contains over 1 million bricks, each one hand-molded and dried. Inside the temple complexes, a new kind of social organization emerges. Hundreds of people work as priests, priestesses, scribes, craftsmen, laborers, all supported by the temple's agricultural wealth. The temples own vast tracts of land, herds of animals, workshops producing textiles, pottery, and metal goods. They're not just religious centers, but economic powerhouses, early corporations that accumulate and manage wealth on an unprecedented scale. The priests develop sophisticated systems for tracking resources, for organizing labor, for distributing rations to workers. Out of this need for economic management will come one of humanity's most revolutionary inventions. Around 3400 BCE, writing is invented in Uruk. The earliest texts are simple pictographs scratched into clay tablets, recording economic transactions. A tablet might show the symbol for sheep, followed by a number. Another records quantities of grain distributed as rations. These aren't literature or history. They're accounting, the mundane but essential record-keeping required to manage a complex economy. But this simple beginning will evolve rapidly. Within a few centuries, the pictographs become more abstract. Combinations of signs can represent sounds rather than just objects, and the writing system known as cuneiform emerges, capable of recording anything that can be spoken. With writing comes history, law, literature, science, and all the other products of literate civilization. The city's growth creates entirely new occupations. Metal workers craft copper tools and ornamental objects, working in specialized workshops. Potters mass-produce ceramics using the wheel, another Uruk period innovation that increases production speed dramatically. Weavers create textiles, masons shape stone. Jewelers work with precious materials imported from distant lands. For the first time in human history, most people in a community don't directly produce their own food. They depend on the surplus created by others, on the systems of distribution and exchange that channel resources through the city. This economic complexity requires new forms of organization. The temple institutions grow more powerful, managing not just religious affairs, but economic production, trade, and resource distribution. The figure of the Lugal emerges literally big man, a leader who combines religious, economic, and military authority. This is the prototype of kingship, though the institution is still developing. The city needs defense, dispute resolution, construction coordination, water management. Someone must make decisions, mobilize labor, organize defense. Power concentrates in fewer hands. The city's physical form reflects these new hierarchies. The temple platforms tower over everything, visible from kilometers away, asserting the dominance of the gods and their earthly representatives. Around the temples, elite residences are built, larger houses with more rooms, better construction, courtyards, and decorative elements. The wealthy live near the center of power. Further out, the houses become smaller, more crowded. The poorest neighborhoods cluster near the city walls. Houses packed tightly together, sharing walls, opening onto narrow alleys barely wide enough for a person to pass. The city needs infrastructure. Wells are dug to supplement river water. Drainage systems channel wastewater and rainwater away from inhabited areas. Streets, though unpaved, are laid out with some regularity in newer neighborhoods. Markets emerge, open spaces where farmers bring produce. Craftsmen sell their goods, and merchants offer exotic items from distant places. The city is becoming a machine for living, a complex organism that requires constant maintenance and management. Trade expands dramatically. Uruk needs resources it doesn't have. Timber from the mountains to the north, stone for tools and construction, metals, precious stones, exotic materials. Merchants travel hundreds of kilometers, establishing trade networks that connect Mesopotamia with Anatolia, Iran, the Levant, and beyond. Some archaeologists even speak of an Uruk expansion, pointing to settlements in distant regions that show clear Uruk influence in pottery styles, architecture, and administrative practices. Whether these are colonies, trading posts, or simply local communities adopting Uruk innovations remains debated. But clearly, Uruk's influence spreads far beyond its walls. The city develops a distinct culture and identity. Religious festivals bring the population together. Processions move through the streets. Offerings are made at the temples. Stories and myths circulate, telling of gods and heroes, explaining the world, justifying the social order. Art flourishes, cylinder seals carved with intricate scenes, stone vessels decorated with complex designs, sculptures of humans and animals. A particularly famous artifact from this period is the Worka vase, a carved alabaster vessel over a meter tall, showing a procession of offerings to the goddess Inanna. The bottom register shows water and plants, the middle shows animals and men, and the top shows the goddess receiving offerings. The whole cosmos is represented, with humanity occupying its proper place in the divine order. But Uruk also faces challenges unknown to earlier communities. Disease spreads more easily in dense populations. Waste disposal becomes a constant problem. Social tensions arise between rich and poor, between the powerful and the powerless. Crime emerges as a category requiring management. The city needs organization, rules, enforcement. The seeds of law and government are planted, though formal law codes are still centuries in the future. By 3000 BC, Uruk is not alone. Other cities have emerged throughout southern Mesopotamia, each with its own temple complexes, its own gods, its own economic and political organization. Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, these names will echo through history. They are independent city-states, often competing for resources, sometimes cooperating, occasionally going to war. The urban age has fully dawned, and Mesopotamia is becoming a landscape of cities, each one a marvel of human organization and ingenuity. The Uruk Revolution has succeeded. Humanity has invented a new way of living, one that concentrates thousands of people in small areas. That requires complex coordination and hierarchy, that depends on agricultural surplus and extensive trade, that produces writing, art, architecture, and specialized knowledge. The city exists and it works. But maintaining and developing these urban societies will require continued innovation, adaptation, and the work of countless individuals whose names are lost to history, but whose collective efforts built civilization. Chapter 3. The Age of Temples, the early 3rd millennium. BCE witnesses the full flowering of the temple-centered economy in Mesopotamia. The cities are established, writing is spreading, and the temple institutions have become the dominant organizing force in society. This is the era that archaeologists call the early dynastic period, spanning roughly 2900 to 2350 BC, and it is characterized by a particular form of social organization in which the temple complexes function as the heart of urban life, controlling vast resources and organizing society in ways both sophisticated and to modern eyes strange. The temple is not what you might imagine when you hear the word today. It's not primarily a place where ordinary people come to worship, though religious ceremonies certainly occur there. Instead, the Mesopotamian temple is better understood as a combination of cathedral, palace, corporation, and welfare state, all rolled into one sprawling complex. The god or goddess is understood to literally own the temple and its holdings. The god is the landlord. The boss, the king, and the priests are the divine managers, administering the deity's earthly estate. Let's enter one of these temple complexes, the Shrine of Ningirsu in the city of Lagash, around 2500 BCE. you approach through the city streets, past the houses of artisans and merchants, and suddenly the temple precinct rises before you. Massive mud brick walls enclose an area of several hectares. Guards stand at the gates, controlling access to this sacred space. Inside, the complex is like a city within a city. There are the temple buildings themselves, sitting atop their raised platforms, accessed by staircases. But there are also administrative buildings, workshops, granaries, livestock pens, housing for priests and temple workers, courtyards, gardens, and subsidiary shrines. The organization is extraordinarily complex. The temple employs hundreds or even thousands of people in various capacities. There are priests and priestesses of different ranks, performing daily rituals to honor and feed the god. There are scribes keeping meticulous records of every transaction, every delivery of goods, every ration distributed to workers. There are farmers working the temple's lands, fishermen bringing in catches from the rivers and marshes, shepherds tending temple flocks. There are weavers producing textiles in temple workshops, metalworkers crafting tools and religious objects, bakers turning temple grain into bread, brewers making beer. Beer deserves special mention because it's central to the Mesopotamian economy and social life. The Sumerians are enthusiastic beer drinkers, and beer is more than just a beverage. It's a form of payment, a nutritional supplement, a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water, and a sacred offering to the gods. The temples maintain large-scale brewing operations, and beer rations are part of the payment for many workers. A laborer might receive 2 or 3 liters of beer per day, plus bread and sometimes oil or other foods. This isn't drunken chaos. The beer is relatively weak by modern standards, more like liquid bread than what we think of as beer today. The temple records preserved on clay tablets give us extraordinary insight into this economic system. We can see exactly how much grain the temple received from its fields, how much was allocated to different purposes, seed for next year's planting, rations for workers, offerings to the god, trade goods. We can see the names of individuals, their occupations, their rations. We know that a high-ranking priest might receive 30 liters of grain per month, while a laborer gets 10. We can track shipments of goods, movements of livestock, work assignments for crews of laborers. It's an accountant's paradise and a historian's treasure trove. This level of organization requires literacy, and literacy in this period is controlled by a small class of professional scribes. Learning to write cuneiform is a years-long process. A scribe in training, typically starting as a young boy, spends years copying out standard texts, learning hundreds of signs, memorizing the conventions of different types of documents. It's difficult, technical work, but it provides entry into the administrative elite. Scribes are respected, relatively well paid, and essential to the functioning of temple and palace administrations. They form a distinct social class, sometimes comparing themselves favorably to craftsmen and farmers in their own texts, celebrating the superiority of the pen over the plow. The temples aren't just economic centers. They're also hubs of specialized knowledge. Temple priests develop sophisticated mathematics needed for measuring fields, calculating grain volumes, dividing rations, and tracking calendrical cycles for determining festival dates. The Sumerians use a sexagesimal number system based on 60, which seems odd until you realize that 60 is evenly divisible by many numbers, making calculations easier. This system survives today in our division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Astronomical observation develops in temple contexts because religious festivals must occur at proper times, which requires tracking lunar cycles and seasonal changes. The priests notice patterns, record observations, and develop increasingly accurate predictions of celestial events. This isn't science in the modern sense. It's thoroughly embedded in religious worldview. It involves careful observation, record keeping, and logical reasoning. Medicine is another area of temple-associated expertise. Priest-physicians combine practical knowledge of herbs and treatments with magical rituals and incantations. They understand that certain plants have predictable effects on the body. They set broken bones. They treat wounds. But they also believe that many illnesses have supernatural causes: the anger of gods, the malice of demons, curses by enemies. Treatment, therefore, combines the practical and the magical. A patient might receive both a poultice for a wound and an incantation to drive away evil spirits. This might seem irrational to us, but in a world where the causes of disease are invisible and mysterious, such an approach is entirely logical. The cities of this period are independent city-states, each with its own patron deity, its own government, and its own interests. Lagash worships Ningirsu. Ur worships the moon god Nana. Uruk reveres Inanna. Nippur is sacred to Enlil, the king of the gods. These cities sometimes cooperate, sharing religious festivals, trading goods, forming alliances. But they also compete fiercely for resources, especially water rights and agricultural land. Border disputes are endemic, and they can lead to warfare. The city-states field armies composed of drafted farmers led by professional soldiers. Military technology is developing rapidly. Body armor made of leather with metal reinforcement becomes common. The bow is a standard weapon, along with spears and axes. The most prestigious military unit is the phalanx, a dense formation of soldiers with large rectangular shields, moving in coordinated ranks. It's an early version of the formations that will dominate ancient warfare for millennia. One famous conflict between Lagash and its neighbor Umma drags on for generations, producing some of our earliest historical inscriptions. The ruler of Lagash, Anedum, erects a monument called the Stele of the Vultures around 2460 BCE, commemorating his victory over Umma. The carved relief shows soldiers marching in phalanx formation, trampling the bodies of enemies, while vultures feast on the dead, hence the name. The inscription describes the conflict in detail, including the religious justifications for war, the divine support for Lagash, and the terms imposed on the defeated. It's propaganda, certainly, but it's also history, our earliest detailed account of a specific war. Political power in this period is complex and contested. In theory, the city belongs to its god, and the temple administration serves the divine landlord. But in practice, secular rulers are emerging. Figures called Ensi or Lugal who command armies, organize major construction projects, and claim increasing authority. The relationship between temple and palace, between priests and kings, is sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive. Some rulers emphasize their piety and subordination to the gods. Others assert more independent authority. The most remarkable ruler of this era is a woman, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, appointed as high priestess of the moon god in Ur around 2285 BCE. Enheduanna is not just a religious figure. She's a poet and author, the first writer in history whose name we know. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna are literary masterpieces, combining personal devotion with political messaging, celebrating divine power while legitimizing her father's rule. She writes in the first person, expressing her own thoughts and emotions, creating a voice that speaks to us across 43 centuries. I, Enheduanna, will sing your praise, she writes to Inanna, and we can still hear her song. The cities themselves continue to develop physically. The temple platforms grow higher and more elaborate, some incorporating multiple levels of terraces, approached by multiple staircases. These are the ancestors of the ziggurats, the stepped pyramid temples that will become iconic in later periods. The temples are decorated with increasing elaboration, walls covered in decorative cone mosaics, doorways flanked by guardian figures, interiors adorned with precious materials. Elite residences become more sophisticated, with multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards, sophisticated drainage systems, and decorative elements. Archaeological excavation of elite houses reveals comfortable, even luxurious living. Spacious rooms, plastered and painted walls, built-in benches and storage areas, private chapels for household gods. The wealthy live well, served by slaves and servants, displaying their status through fine clothing, jewelry, and elaborate grave goods. The graves themselves tell stories of hierarchy and wealth. Common people are buried simply, often beneath the floors of houses, wrapped in mats or placed in ceramic coffins, accompanied by a few pots and personal items. But elite burials are elaborate affairs. The royal cemetery of Ur, dating to around 2600 BCE, contains tombs that astound in their wealth and their horror. Kings and queens are buried with incredible treasures, gold and lapis lazuli jewelry, elaborate headdresses, musical instruments, fine vessels, game boards. But they're also buried with human attendants. In some tombs, dozens of servants, soldiers, and musicians apparently accompanied their rulers into death, possibly drinking poison or being killed to serve in the afterlife. Whether these attendants went willingly, believing in their religious duty, or were coerced, we cannot know. But the practice reveals both the wealth and the stark hierarchies of this society. The Temple Age represents the full maturation of the first urban civilization, but also the seeds of its transformation. The temples are powerful, but secular rulers are gaining strength. The independent city-states produce cultural flowering, but also endless conflict. The stage is set for the next great transformation, the emergence of empires, when ambitious rulers will attempt to unite these competing cities under single rule, creating political entities of unprecedented scale and ambition. Chapter 4. The First Empire. The endless conflicts between Sumerian city-states create conditions ripe for a revolutionary political development. Around 2334 BCE, a man named Sargon seizes power in the city of Kish, then launches a series of military campaigns that will transform the political landscape of Mesopotamia and create something entirely new in human history, an empire. This is not just conquest. It is the invention of a new form of political organization that will become the dominant model for large-scale societies for the next 3,000 years. Sargon himself is a figure shrouded in legend, which he and his successors deliberately cultivate. Later accounts claim he was born to a priestess who set him adrift in a reed basket on the Euphrates, where he was found and raised by a gardener. This is myth-making, of course, deliberately echoing earlier hero tales, but it reveals something important. Sargon is an outsider, not born to power, who seizes it through ability and ambition. Whether the basket story is true or not, Sargon is definitely not from the traditional Sumerian elite. He's ethnically Akkadian, speaking a Semitic language rather than Sumerian, and he rises to power through military prowess and political cunning. After taking control of Kish, Sargon establishes his own capital at a new location called Akkad, whose exact location is still unknown to archaeologists. From this power base, he launches a systematic conquest of the Sumerian city-states. One by one they fall: Uruk, Lagash, Umma. The campaigns are brutal. Cities that resist are besieged and sacked. Walls are torn down. Temples are pillaged. Rulers are captured or killed. But Sargon is not just a destroyer. He's a state builder. After conquest, he installs his own governors, typically Akkadian nobles or military commanders. He leaves local administrations largely intact but subordinates them to his central authority. Tax revenues flow to Akkad. Troops are levied from conquered territories. Local gods are respected, even honored, but are subordinated to the imperial ideology that places Sargon as the supreme earthly ruler. The scale of conquest is unprecedented. Sargon's inscriptions claim he conquers not just the Sumerian heartland but extends his power far beyond, reaching the Mediterranean Sea to the west, the mountains of Anatolia to the north, and Elam to the east. Some of these claims are probably exaggerated, but archaeological evidence confirms that Akkadian influence does spread over an enormous area. Trade networks expand dramatically under imperial rule. Sargon boasts that ships from distant lands dock at Akkad's wharves, bringing exotic goods from across the known world. The Akkadian Empire represents a fundamental reimagining of political possibilities. Previously, the city-state was the largest political unit people could conceive. The idea that dozens of cities with different gods, languages, and traditions could be united under single rule was radical. Sargon and his successors developed new tools of imperial administration, standardized weights and measures, a unified date-keeping system, a professional bureaucracy staffed by Akkadian officials who can be moved between different posts. The old Sumerian city-state governments don't disappear, but they're now embedded in a larger structure. Language policy reveals the empire's nature. Akkadian becomes the language of administration and diplomacy, gradually replacing Sumerian for official purposes. But this is pragmatic adaptation rather than cultural genocide. Sumerian remains important for religious purposes, for traditional literature, for learned discourse. The empire is bilingual, even multilingual, reflecting the diversity it encompasses. Scribes learn both languages, and many texts are written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, or mix the two languages. Sargon rules for an impressive 56 years, dying around 2279 BCE. His sons succeed him, maintaining the empire through military force and political skill. The most successful is his grandson Naram-Sin, who rules from 2254 to 2218 BCE. Naram-Sin takes imperial ideology to new heights, literally. He has himself depicted in art wearing the horned crown traditionally reserved for gods, implying divine status. He styles himself King of the Four Quarters, claiming dominion over the entire world as the Mesopotamians understand it. His famous victory stele shows him ascending a mountain, trampling enemies underfoot, while stars representing gods shine approvingly above. But empires built by conquest face inherent problems. The Akkadian military must constantly campaign to maintain control and suppress rebellions. The conquered cities resent their subjugation, particularly the proud Sumerians who see themselves as culturally superior to the Akkadian upstarts. Local rulers chafe under imperial governors. The empire is expensive to maintain, requiring enormous resources to support the army, the bureaucracy, and the imperial court. The economic basis of the empire involves systematic extraction of resources from subject territories. Taxes are collected, tribute demanded, labor conscripted for imperial projects. Sargon and his successors undertake massive construction works, temples to legitimize their rule, fortifications to protect their territories, palaces to display their power. The imperial capital Akkad becomes a showcase city, though its remains are frustratingly undiscovered by modern archaeologists. The empire also faces external threats. Beyond the territories under direct Akkadian control, hostile groups threaten the borders. Mountain peoples from the Zagros Mountains raid the eastern frontiers. Groups from the Syrian desert harass western territories. The empire must maintain large military forces on multiple frontiers, stretching resources thin. Around 2193 BCE, the Akkadian Empire collapses with surprising speed. The exact causes are debated by historians. Some inscriptions blame invasions by the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains who sweep through Akkadian territories. Climate data suggests that this period coincides with a severe drought lasting decades, which would have disrupted agriculture, sparked famine, and destabilized the social order. Probably the collapse results from a combination of factors: environmental stress, internal rebellions, external invasions, and the inherent instability of an empire held together primarily by military force. Whatever the exact causes, the results are clear. The Akkadian capital is destroyed. Imperial administration breaks down. the unified state fragments back into competing city-states. For several generations, Mesopotamia experiences political chaos, what later Sumerian texts will remember as a dark age when foreign barbarians ruled. The Ushans control parts of the region, though how extensive or organized their rule is remains unclear. Some cities maintain independence, continuing their old patterns of life. Trade networks contract. Literacy rates probably decline. It's a period of disruption and regression. But amid the chaos, some cities maintain order and eventually prosper. The city of Lagash, under its ruler Gudea, becomes a cultural beacon. Gudea rules as Ensi of Lagash around 2144 to 2124 BCE, during the post-Akkadian chaos, and he provides a fascinating contrast to the imperial military rulers who preceded him. Gudea is a temple builder, not a conqueror. He commissions numerous statues of himself, more than 20 of which survive, showing him in the posture of pious devotion, hands clasped, eyes attentive, the very image of a humble servant of the gods. The inscriptions on these statues describe his building projects in elaborate detail, emphasizing his role as the faithful steward who builds houses for the gods. Gudea's inscriptions reveal the extent of trade networks even in this period of political fragmentation. To build his temple to the god Ningirsu, he imports materials from astonishing distances: cedar from Lebanon, copper from the mountains of Oman, gold from Egypt or Anatolia, diorite stone from distant quarries. The temple building texts read almost like adventure stories, describing expeditions to remote lands to acquire precious materials. This suggests that while the political empire collapsed, economic connections and trade continued, perhaps even flourished without imperial restrictions and taxes. The Ushan period ends when the city of Uruk, under its ruler Utuhigel, drives out the Ushan king around 2120 BCE. But Utuhigel's triumph is short-lived. Within a few years, power shifts to the city of Ur, where a new dynasty emerges that will create what many historians consider the pinnacle of Sumerian civilization. The third dynasty of Ur, often abbreviated as Ur III. The founder of this dynasty, Ur-Nammu, comes to power around 2112 BCE. He learns from the Akkadian experiment, but adapts it to Sumerian traditions. Rather than presenting himself as a military conqueror, Ur-Nammu emphasizes his role as restorer of order, builder of temples, establisher of justice. He reunifies much of Mesopotamia under Ur's control, but frames it as returning to proper order rather than brutal conquest. The propaganda is sophisticated and effective. Ur-Nammu's most lasting achievement is his law code, the earliest substantial legal text we possess, predating the famous Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. The prologue describes Ur-Nammu as establishing justice in the land, protecting the weak from the powerful, ensuring fair weights and measures. The laws themselves address practical matters: murder, theft, marriage, divorce, inheritance, property disputes. The penalties are often monetary fines rather than the harsh physical punishments that will characterize later codes. A man who causes a bone to break pays a specific amount of silver. Someone who divorces without cause must pay compensation. The laws reveal a society with sophisticated concepts of justice, property rights, and social obligation. Under Ur-Nammu and his successors, particularly his son Shulgi, who rules for nearly 50 years, the Ur III state develops into what some scholars call the first true bureaucratic state, with administrative control penetrating to remarkable depths into society. The cuneiform records from this period are staggeringly detailed. Tens of thousands of tablets survive, recording every aspect of economic life. We know exactly how many sheep were in temple flocks, how much wool they produced, how that wool was distributed to workers, how much cloth was woven, where that cloth went. We can track individual workers, their names, their rations, their work assignments. We can see the routes of messengers crisscrossing the empire, the supplies given to them for their journeys, the documents they carried. This administrative intensity suggests a state that is both highly efficient and potentially oppressive. The government knows everything, controls everything, or at least attempts to. Workers are assigned to labor groups, receive standard rations, perform set tasks. There is little space for individual initiative or freedom. The state operates like a vast machine, with people as interchangeable parts. The term bureaucratic despotism has been used to describe this system, and it fits uncomfortably well. The dynasty invests heavily in infrastructure. Canals are dug and maintained on a massive scale, creating an irrigation network of unprecedented extent. Roads are built connecting major cities, with way stations for messengers and travelers. Defensive walls are constructed along the empire's northern and eastern frontiers, attempting to keep out the Amorites and other groups from the deserts and mountains. These walls stretch for over 100 kilometers in some sectors, requiring enormous labor investment. The ziggurat, the step temple tower, reaches its most developed form under Ur III. The great ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu and his son, still stands today in its reconstructed glory, a massive artificial mountain of mud brick, rising in 3 terraces to a height of over 20 meters. The temple at the summit has long since disappeared, but the structure itself remains as testament to the organizational capacity and religious devotion of this society. Similar ziggurats are built at other major cities, marking the landscape with geometric mountains that proclaim both divine power and human ambition. Religious life under Ur III is formalized and systematized. Festivals occur according to precise calendars. Offerings to gods are standardized. The kings present themselves as shepherds of their people, chosen by the gods to maintain order and justice. Royal hymns, some possibly composed by the kings themselves, describe their piety, wisdom, and strength. King Shulgi claims to be a scholar, a scribe, a master of many languages, a mighty warrior, a swift runner, the perfect king, combining all desirable attributes. Yet beneath this carefully crafted image of order and prosperity, tensions simmer. The Amorites, Semitic-speaking peoples from the western deserts, are increasingly pressing against Ur's frontiers. Despite the defensive walls, they infiltrate Mesopotamia in growing numbers, settling peacefully in some cases, raiding in others. The Ur III administration becomes increasingly paranoid about security, building more fortifications, tightening border controls, conducting military campaigns against desert tribes. The economic system shows signs of strain. The detailed records reveal occasional shortages, difficulties meeting ration obligations, problems with labor recruitment. The system is rigid, unable to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. When things go well, it runs smoothly. But any disruption, crop failure, military defeat, administrative corruption creates cascading problems throughout the interconnected system. Around 2004 BCE, disaster strikes. The Elamites from the east invade Mesopotamia, sack Ur, and capture the last king of the dynasty, Ibisin. The great city is devastated, its temples burned, its population killed or carried off as captives. A later Sumerian poem, The Lamentation over the Destruction of Ur, describes the catastrophe in heartbreaking detail. The gods abandoning the city, the people crying out for mercy, the destruction of sacred places, the silence falling over streets once bustling with life. It's one of the most emotionally powerful texts from ancient Mesopotamia, expressing genuine grief over a traumatic historical event. The fall of Ur III marks the effective end of Sumerian political independence. Though Sumerian culture, language, and religion will continue to influence Mesopotamia for 2,000 more years, the Sumerians will never again rule their own large-scale state. The future belongs to Semitic-speaking peoples, Amorites, Babylonians, Assyrians who build on Sumerian foundations but create their own distinctive civilizations. The experiment with empires spanning decades or centuries has proven that large-scale political unification is possible, but difficult to maintain. The Akkadian Empire showed that military conquest could unite diverse cities, but couldn't necessarily keep them united. The Ur-3 state demonstrated that sophisticated bureaucracy could manage an empire's economy and society, but couldn't make the system flexible enough to survive major shocks. The lessons are clear. Empires require military force, administrative skill, ideological legitimation, economic prosperity, and considerable luck. Future empire builders will learn from these early experiments, refining the techniques of imperial rule that the Mesopotamians pioneered. Chapter 5. The Age of Hammurabi. The collapse of Ur-3 plunges Mesopotamia into a period of political fragmentation that lasts for 2 centuries. The Amorites, those Semitic-speaking peoples from the western deserts, no longer press at the borders. They pour in, establishing their own dynasties in the old Sumerian cities. By 1900 BCE, virtually every major city in Mesopotamia is ruled by an Amorite king. But these rulers don't destroy Mesopotamian civilization. They adopt it, adapt it, and eventually transform it into something new. From this melting pot of Sumerian tradition and Amorite innovation emerges classical Babylonian civilization, reaching its zenith under its most famous king, Hammurabi. The city of Babylon itself is not particularly ancient or distinguished in early Mesopotamian history. It's a relatively minor settlement during the Sumerian period, overshadowed by greater cities like Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. But its location is strategic, sitting on the Euphrates at a point where the river comes close to the Tigris, controlling trade routes between north and south. When an Amorite dynasty establishes itself in Babylon around 1894 BCE, the city begins its rise to prominence. For over a century, the Babylonian kings are minor players in the complicated power politics of Mesopotamia. The region is divided among numerous small kingdoms, constantly forming and breaking alliances, fighting limited wars, competing for influence. The major powers include the Kingdom of Larsa in the south, Eshnunna to the northeast, Elam to the east, and Assyria to the north. Babylon is important but not dominant, powerful but not supreme. This changes when Hammurabi ascends the throne in 1792 BCE, the 6th king of Babylon's Amorite dynasty. Hammurabi initially appears to be yet another competent but unremarkable ruler. His early years focus on typical kingly duties, maintaining irrigation canals, building temple walls, establishing justice, keeping the peace. His date formulas, the way each year is named for a significant event, mention projects like the year when Hammurabi dug the canal called Hammurabi Dash is Dash Abundance Dash for Dash the people, or the year when Hammurabi made a throne for the god Marduk. These are the concerns of a pious, capable administrator, not a world conqueror. For 3 decades, Hammurabi plays the diplomatic game skillfully but cautiously. He maintains alliances, avoids dangerous conflicts, builds up Babylon's resources and military strength. But in the 30th year of his reign, something changes. Perhaps he judges the moment is right. Perhaps circumstances force his hand. Perhaps he's been planning all along. Suddenly, Hammurabi launches a series of aggressive military campaigns that will, over the next 14 years, make him master of all Mesopotamia. The campaigns are methodical and ruthless. In his 30th year, Hammurabi attacks and conquers Larsa, the powerful kingdom to the south. In his 31st year, he defeats Eshnunna. In his 32nd year, he conquers the Assyrian territories. In his 33rd year, he defeats Mari, a wealthy trading city on the Euphrates that has long been a center of international diplomacy. One by one, the rival powers fall. By 1755 BCE, when Hammurabi is an old man by ancient standards, he rules an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to Assyria, the largest unified state since Your-3's collapse 2.5 centuries earlier. But Hammurabi is more than a conqueror. He's a state builder and, in his own estimation, a champion of justice. His most famous legacy is his law code, inscribed on a black basalt stele over 2 meters tall and displayed publicly in Babylon. The stele's top shows Hammurabi standing before the sun god Shamash, the divine patron of justice, receiving the laws directly from the god. The message is clear. These laws have divine authority, and Hammurabi is their earthly enforcer. The Code of Hammurabi contains 282 laws addressing everything from commercial disputes to family matters, from property rights to professional liability, from theft to murder. The laws are casuistic, taking the form, if this situation occurs, then this penalty applies. They reveal a complex, hierarchical society with detailed categories and distinctions. There are different classes of people: Awalu, free citizens; Mashkanu, commoners or dependents; and Wardu, slaves. And the laws often specify different penalties depending on the status of perpetrator and victim. Some laws are surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of negligence and liability. Law 229 states, if a builder builds a house for a man and does not make its construction sound, and the house collapses and causes the death of the owner, that builder shall be killed. Law 230 continues, if it causes the death of the owner's son, they shall kill the son of the builder. This is the famous principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. To modern sensibilities, this seems harsh, even barbaric. But in historical context, it represents an advance, proportional justice, limiting revenge to what is equivalent to the harm done. Before codified law, a killing might spark a blood feud, destroying entire families. The law imposes restraint. Other laws address economic matters with considerable detail. Interest rates are regulated. Contract terms are specified. Merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and professionals all have their obligations and rights defined. A surgeon who performs successful eye surgery receives a set fee, but if the operation fails and the patient loses sight, the surgeon's hand is cut off. The stakes are high, reflecting both the value placed on professional competence and the harsh penalties for failure. Family law occupies substantial space in the code. Marriage is primarily an economic arrangement between families, formalized by contract. Dowries and bride prices are specified. Adultery is punished severely, typically by drowning for both parties, though there are exceptions and complications. Divorce is possible, but regulated, with different rules for men and women. If a man divorces his wife without cause, he must return her dowry and provide for her. Children are valuable economic assets. Adoption contracts are detailed and specific. Inheritance rules protect daughters' rights, at least to some degree, though sons receive preferential treatment. The prologue and epilogue of the code frame the laws in broader terms. Hammurabi presents himself as the pious king chosen by the gods to establish justice, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, to make the land prosper. He invites anyone who has been wronged to come to the stele and have the laws read to them, ensuring that justice is accessible even to the illiterate. The epilogue invokes elaborate curses on any future ruler who might alter these laws, calling on the gods to destroy his kingdom, curse his reign, and make his name forgotten. It's powerful propaganda as much as practical law. How often were these laws actually applied in Mesopotamian courts? That's harder to determine. Legal documents from the period show considerable variation in how disputes are actually resolved, suggesting the code is more aspirational than operational, more display of kingly wisdom than daily legal reference. But as propaganda, as a statement of values, as a model of justice, the Code of Hammurabi is immensely influential, copied and studied for over 1,000 years after Hammurabi's death. The correspondence from Hammurabi's reign, hundreds of letters on clay tablets, reveals a different side of the king. Not the remote dispenser of divine justice, but a hands-on micromanager concerned with details of administration. He writes to his governors about canal maintenance, grain deliveries, troop movements, tax collection, and judicial disputes. "Send me the men," he orders in one letter. "Make sure the work is completed by the flood season," he instructs in another. He demands reports, questions decisions, intervenes in local matters. The picture that emerges is of an intelligent, energetic, detail-oriented ruler who genuinely tries to manage his kingdom effectively. Babylon itself flourishes under Hammurabi. The city grows in size and splendor, though much of ancient Babylon lies beneath the water table and cannot be excavated by archaeologists. The city walls are strengthened and extended. The temples, particularly the Temple of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, receive lavish attention and offerings. Marduk himself rises in the pantheon, beginning his journey from local city god to supreme deity of Babylonian religion, a transformation that will culminate centuries later with his exaltation as king of the gods in the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. The empire Hammurabi creates is impressive, but, like earlier empires, fragile. Hammurabi dies around 1750 BCE after a reign of 43 years. His son Samshu-Iluna inherits the throne, but immediately faces rebellions. The south breaks away, establishing a rival dynasty in the old Sumerian heartland. Over the next century and a half, the Babylonian Empire slowly contracts, losing territory to rebels, invaders, and rival powers. The empire proves difficult to hold together without Hammurabi's personal force and skill. Yet Hammurabi's cultural legacy far outlasts his political empire. The Code of Hammurabi becomes a classic text, copied by scribes for over 1,000 years. The model of kingship he represents, the pious builder, the establisher of justice, the shepherd of his people, becomes the template for Mesopotamian rulers. His dynasty's remotion of Babylon and Marduk establishes the city and its god as central to Mesopotamian civilization. When later kings want to legitimize their rule, they claim to be restoring the glory of Hammurabi's age. The Old Babylonian period, as historians call the era from roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, is a cultural golden age in many ways. Sumerian literature is collected, preserved, and translated into Akkadian. New literary works are composed, including love poems, wisdom literature, and mythological epics. Mathematics reaches impressive sophistication. Babylonian mathematicians can solve quadratic equations, calculate areas and volumes, and work with geometric progressions. Astronomy advances with systematic observations of planetary movements. Medicine continues developing, with growing pharmacological knowledge alongside magical healing practices. The scribal schools, called Eduba in Sumerian, literally tablet house, train young men in the arts of literacy, mathematics, and administration. We have school texts showing the curriculum. Students copy out lists of cuneiform signs, practice arithmetic problems, memorize literary classics, and learn proper letter formats. The text also revealed the harsh discipline of these schools, with beatings for students who misbehave, arrive late, or fail to master their lessons. Education is valuable but brutal, accessible only to elite families who can afford to keep their sons out of productive work for years of training. Society remains highly stratified, with clear distinctions between free citizens, dependents, and slaves. But there is also mobility, particularly through the scribal profession or military service. A capable scribe from modest background can rise to important administrative positions. A successful soldier can be rewarded with land grants. The society is hierarchical, but not entirely closed. Women's status is complex and varies by class. Elite women can own property, conduct business, and appear in court. The daughters and wives of wealthy families sometimes manage substantial estates. But women are also subordinate to male authority. Fathers, husbands, brothers, and face severe penalties for certain offenses that may escape. The double standards in the law codes are obvious and significant. Yet within these constraints, some women exercise real power, particularly as priestesses in major temples or as businesswomen in commercial cities. The Old Babylonian period demonstrates that civilization has fully matured in Mesopotamia. The techniques of urban living, of state administration, of cultural production are well established. The remaining question is whether these achievements can survive the coming storm. Because around 1600 BCE, a new threat emerges that will devastate Mesopotamia and end the Old Babylonian period in violence and chaos. The Hittites from Anatolia raid Babylon itself, sacking the great city and carrying off Marduk's statue. The Hammurabi dynasty ends, and a new dark age begins. Chapter 6. Engineering the waters. To understand how Mesopotamian cities functioned and survived, we must turn from politics and culture to something more fundamental: water. The great cities of Mesopotamia exist only because humans learned to control and redirect water on a massive scale, transforming a harsh, unpredictable environment into agricultural surplus capable of supporting dense urban populations. The engineering achievement is as important as any law code or conquest, and in many ways more impressive. The hydraulic civilization of Mesopotamia represents humanity's first sustained attempt to reshape nature itself according to human needs. The challenge begins with geography and climate. Southern Mesopotamia, the heartland of Sumerian civilization, is hot and dry, receiving less than 200 millimeters of rainfall annually, almost all falling in a brief winter season. This is far too little water to support agriculture. Without irrigation, the region is desert. Yet the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carry enormous volumes of water from the mountains of Anatolia and the Zagros, water that flows through this arid land on its way to the Persian Gulf. The rivers are potential wealth, but only if that water can be captured and directed to the fields. The second challenge is timing. The rivers flood in late spring, fed by snowmelt in the distant mountains, reaching their peak just when farmers need to harvest winter crops. This is precisely the wrong time for a flood. Compare this to Egypt, where the Nile floods in late summer, perfectly timed for the agricultural cycle. The Mesopotamian farmers must somehow store or redirect the spring floodwaters for use during the hot summer months when irrigation is essential. It's a complex problem requiring sophisticated solutions. The third challenge is the rivers themselves. The Euphrates, slower and more predictable, is easier to manage. The Tigris, faster and more violent, is dangerous. Both rivers carry enormous loads of silt, which builds up in irrigation channels, requiring constant maintenance. Both rivers can change course, abandoning old channels and cutting new ones, destroying years of infrastructure work in a single season. And both rivers, especially the Euphrates, flow in beds above the surrounding plain in their lower reaches, having built up their banks over millennia. This creates the constant danger of catastrophic flooding if levees fail. The earliest irrigation systems, dating back to the 6th millennium BCE, are simple and small-scale. Farmers dig short channels from streams or river branches to nearby fields, perhaps constructing small levees to control water flow during floods. A single family or small group can construct and maintain these simple systems, which water a few hectares at most. But as settlements grow larger and populations increase, irrigation must become more extensive and complex. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the Uruk period, irrigation has evolved into an impressive engineering system. Major canals stretch for kilometers, some large enough to be navigable by boat, serving as both irrigation channels and transportation routes. These canals branch into smaller channels, which divide further into field ditches. The water flows by gravity, so the entire system must be carefully planned and constructed with proper gradients. Too steep, and water flows too fast, eroding channels. Too shallow, and water doesn't flow at all, pooling and creating swamps. The engineering requires mathematical knowledge. Surveyors must measure elevation changes, calculate gradients, determine volumes of earth to be moved. The practical geometry developed for these purposes will later be formalized into the mathematical texts that astound modern scholars with their sophistication. But initially, the knowledge is practical, learned through experience, passed from master to apprentice, refined over generations of trial and error. Construction requires organization of labor on unprecedented scales. A major canal might require moving hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of earth. The tools are simple baskets for carrying earth, digging sticks, simple hose, human muscle power. Later, animal traction is used for the heaviest work, with oxen pulling earth-moving sledges. But mostly it's human labor. Thousands of workers moving earth basket by basket, day after day, season after season. The organizational challenge is as great as the physical one. Workers must be fed, supervised, coordinated. This is one reason why the temple institutions and later the royal palaces become so powerful. Only they can mobilize and manage labor on the necessary scale. The canal system is not static but constantly evolving. Channels silt up and must be dredged. Floods damage levees that must be repaired. New fields are brought under cultivation, requiring new canals. Water rights disputes arise constantly, requiring adjudication. A farmer upstream takes more than his share, depriving those downstream. A city diverts a channel, harming a rival. These disputes appear constantly in ancient legal texts and royal inscriptions. Kings boast of their canal projects and their fair management of water resources. Hammurabi state formulas frequently mention canal construction or repair. The year when Hammurabi dug the canal called Hammurabi is the abundance of the people, or the year when Hammurabi dug the canal called abundance of heaven and earth. The maintenance burden is enormous. Every year, before the flood season, the canals must be cleared of accumulated silt, the levees inspected and repaired, the regulators and gates checked and maintained. This becomes a major occasion on the civic calendar, with labor conscripted from the entire population. Later legal texts specify that property owners must contribute labor to canal maintenance proportional to their holdings. Failure to fulfill this obligation results in fines or punishment. The canals belong to everyone and no one. Communal infrastructure requiring communal maintenance. Water distribution requires careful management. Various methods develop over time. Some cities use appointed water officials who open and close gates, regulating flow to different channels according to schedule and need. Some areas develop rotating systems, with each farmer receiving water for set periods. Some canals have measuring devices, primitive water clocks that determine how long each user can draw water. Disputes are inevitable, and the law codes devote considerable attention to water crimes. Hammurabi's S-Code specifies that if a man is negligent in maintaining his section of canal and causes flooding, he must compensate neighbors for damaged crops. If a man steals water by cutting through someone else's ditch, he must pay grain equal to what his neighbor's fields would have produced. The technological sophistication continues to increase. By the second millennium BCE, engineers have developed various types of lifting devices to raise water from canals to fields that are higher than the water level. The shaduf, a counterweighted lever with a bucket, allows one person to lift water several meters. The water wheel, rotated by animals or humans, can lift continuous flow. These devices extend irrigation's reach, allowing cultivation of land that cannot be served by gravity flow canals alone. Storage becomes possible through sophisticated reservoir systems. In some areas, engineers construct large basins to capture floodwaters, storing them for release during the summer months. These reservoirs can cover hundreds of hectares, holding millions of cubic meters of water. The dikes and gates controlling them are major engineering works. requiring precise construction to prevent catastrophic failures. A reservoir break can destroy cities, drowning thousands, washing away years of agricultural investment. The mastery of water also enables other technologies. The mill, using water power to grind grain, appears by the later periods. Aqueducts carry water across valleys, built with arched construction techniques that will later be perfected by the Romans. In the cities, sophisticated water systems develop, with wells, cisterns, and drainage networks. The largest cities have underground drainage systems carrying wastewater away from inhabited areas, primitive sewers that prevent the cities from drowning in their own filth. The environmental consequences of this massive manipulation of water are profound and not always beneficial. Over-irrigation in areas with poor drainage leads to salt buildup in the soil, a process called salinization. As water evaporates in the hot sun, it leaves behind dissolved salts. Over decades and centuries, the salt concentration increases until fields become unproductive. Texts from the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE document declining yields, particularly of wheat, which is salt-sensitive. Farmers shift to barley, more salt-tolerant but less desirable. Eventually, some areas must be abandoned entirely, too salty for any cultivation. This environmental disaster contributes to the long-term decline of southern Mesopotamia's agricultural productivity, with profound political and economic consequences. The rivers themselves are altered by human activity. Silt that would naturally spread across floodplains to renew soil fertility is instead captured in irrigation channels or flows unused to the sea. The riverbeds rise as silt accumulates, held in place by levees, creating the dangerous situation of rivers flowing above the surrounding plain. When levees eventually fail, as they inevitably do during major floods, the results are catastrophic. The river may cut an entirely new course, abandoning its old channel, leaving cities that depend on that water suddenly high and dry. Several ancient cities are abandoned when their rivers move away, the water sources that sustained urban life simply disappearing as the river finds a new path to the sea. Despite these challenges, and sometimes because of them, the irrigation systems continue to expand and evolve throughout Mesopotamian history. Each successive empire, Akkadian, Year 3, Babylonian, Assyrian, invests heavily in hydraulic infrastructure. Kings compete to build the longest canals, the most secure dikes, the most elaborate distribution systems. This is both practical necessity and ideological statement. A good king makes the land prosper by bringing water to the fields, and prosperity requires increasingly extensive irrigation as populations grow. The psychological and cultural impact of this relationship with water permeates Mesopotamian civilization. The gods of rivers and canals are powerful and must be propitiated. The flood, unpredictable and dangerous, becomes a metaphor for divine power and anger, most famously in the flood story that appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts and later influences the biblical account of Noah. The king's role as provider of water becomes central to royal ideology. Life itself depends on the successful management of water, making hydraulic engineering not just a technical skill, but a sacred responsibility. The ultimate irony is that this great achievement contains the seeds of long-term decline. The very success of Mesopotamian irrigation creates environmental problems that gradually undermine the basis of urban civilization in the southern plain. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, salinization and siltation are serious problems. By the 1st millennium, southern Mesopotamia's agricultural productivity has declined significantly, though northern regions with better drainage and more rainfall continue to flourish. The long-term environmental consequences of intensive irrigation remain relevant today in modern Iraq, where similar problems of soil salinization and water management continue to challenge farmers and engineers. The hydraulic civilization of Mesopotamia demonstrates both humanity as remarkable ingenuity and our dangerous tendency toward overexploitation of resources. The Mesopotamians built a sophisticated technological system that supported dense urban populations for thousands of years, but they couldn't solve the fundamental problem of long-term sustainability. Their achievement is real and impressive. Their failure is instructive and sobering. The cities they built depended entirely on their ability to control water, and when that control proved imperfect or created new problems, the cities themselves became vulnerable. Chapter 7. The written word among all of Mesopotamia's innovations. None is more revolutionary or influential than writing. The invention of cuneiform around 3400 BCE in Uruk fundamentally transforms human society, enabling new forms of organization, new ways of thinking, new possibilities for preserving and transmitting knowledge across time and space. Before writing, all human knowledge must be carried in individual memory, passed through oral tradition, limited by what minds can retain. After writing, knowledge can be externalized, stored, accumulated, and built upon across generations. This single innovation makes complex civilization possible and permanent. The earliest writing is not poetry or prayer, but accounting. The first cuneiform tablets from Uruk record simple economic transactions, quantities of grain, numbers of sheep, allocations of beer rations. A tablet might show a pictograph of a sheep's head next to numerical signs 20 sheep. Another shows beer vessels and quantities 30 liters distributed. These are the mundane records of temple administrators trying to track resources in an increasingly complex economy. The need for record keeping drives the invention. The signs themselves begin as pictographs, simplified pictures of the things they represent. The sign for sheep looks like a sheep's head. The sign for grain shows a grain ear. The sign for fish resembles a fish. But pictographic writing has severe limitations. It's cumbersome, requiring hundreds of different signs for different objects. It can easily represent abstract concepts or grammatical relationships. And crucially, it's language independent, recording concepts but not the sounds of speech. The transformation begins within a few centuries of invention. The pictographs become increasingly abstract, stylized, and simplified. The original pictures are rotated 90 degrees and broken down into combinations of wedge-shaped impressions, made by pressing a reed stylus into clay tablets. This is cuneiform, literally wedge-shaped writing. The signs lose their pictographic character and become abstract symbols. A sign that once obviously represented a sheep becomes an arbitrary combination of wedges that must simply be memorized. Simultaneously, a more profound transformation occurs. The signs begin to represent not just concepts but sounds, phonetic values derived from the Sumerian words for those concepts. The sign for water, pronounced A in Sumerian, can now represent the sound A in any context, not just when talking about actual water. This phonetic principle allows writing to represent the sounds of speech, to record grammatical particles, to write names, to capture the full complexity of language. Writing becomes a true writing system, capable of representing any utterance in the spoken language. But cuneiform never becomes fully phonetic like an alphabet. It remains a mixed system, with some signs representing whole words or concepts, others representing syllables, others serving as semantic determinatives that specify meaning without being pronounced. Learning to read and write cuneiform requires memorizing hundreds of signs, understanding their multiple possible readings, knowing the conventions for when to use word signs versus syllable signs. It's difficult, requiring years of training, which is precisely why scribes become a specialized professional class. The scribal schools, the Ediba, are institutions unique to Mesopotamian civilization, combining aspects of elementary school, vocational training, and cultural indoctrination. Boys, typically from elite families, enter the Ediba around age 7 or 8 and spend the next decade learning to be scribes. The curriculum is standardized and demanding. Students begin by copying lists of cuneiform signs, lists of Sumerian words, lists of trees, animals, tools, officials, gods. These lexical lists serve multiple purposes: teaching writing, building vocabulary, organizing knowledge, and transmitting cultural knowledge. From lists, students progress to model letters, legal documents, mathematical exercises, and literary texts. They copy classic works of literature, memorizing passages from myths, hymns, and epic poems. The works of ancient authors are studied with reverence. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Sumerian itself has died as a spoken language, but it remains the language of learning, like Latin in medieval Europe. Scribes must be bilingual, fluent in both Sumerian and Akkadian, able to translate between them, competent in both literary traditions. The training is harsh. School texts describe frequent beatings for students who misbehave, arrive late, produce sloppy work, or simply fail to learn quickly enough. One famous text, School Days, describes a student's typical day: arriving at school, reciting his lesson, suffering punishment for errors, returning home, and telling his father about his troubles. The father invites the teacher to dinner, offers gifts, and the teacher suddenly discovers that the student is actually quite talented. The text is humorous, but reveals the realities of corporal punishment and the importance of family connections in education. The graduates of these schools form a professional class with significant social prestige and economic security. Scribes work in temples, palaces, private businesses, and as independent contractors. They record contracts, compose letters, maintain accounts, copy literary texts, teach new students. In a civilization where literacy rates are probably below 5%, scribes possess valuable skills that guarantee employment. They often emphasize their superiority over manual laborers in their own texts, celebrating the power of the stylus over the plow. The purposes of writing expand far beyond simple accounting. Legal contracts are recorded on tablets, creating permanent evidence of agreements. If a dispute arises, the tablet can be consulted. Hammurabi's law code is written on stone so that anyone can have it read to them, ensuring access to justice. Royal inscriptions commemorate the deeds of kings, building projects, military victories, divine favor received. These inscriptions are propaganda, certainly, but they're also history, preserving information about specific events, dates, and individuals. Letters become a standard form of communication, not just within cities, but across the vast distances of the Mesopotamian world. Kings correspond with each other, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, demanding tribute. Officials write to their superiors, requesting instructions, reporting on local conditions, requesting resources. Merchants write to distant partners, arranging shipments, confirming prices, resolving disputes. A remarkable archive from the city of Mari, dating to around 1800 BCE, contains over 20,000 tablets, including hundreds of letters that provide intimate glimpses into diplomatic and administrative life. We can read a king's worried correspondence about a predicted eclipse, a queen's letters managing palace affairs, generals reporting on military operations, and officials complaining about inadequate resources. Literature flourishes in written form, though it undoubtedly has deep roots in oral tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest substantial literary work, exists in multiple versions spanning over 1,000 years. The earliest fragments date to around 2100 BCE, written in Sumerian. The most complete version, the Standard Babylonian edition, was composed around 1200 BCE in Akkadian. The epic tells the story of Gilgamesh, legendary king of Uruk, and his friendship with the wild man Enkidu. Together they undertake heroic adventures, defeating monsters and challenging the gods. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is devastated and embarks on a desperate quest for immortality, ultimately learning that death is the fate of all humans and that meaning must be found in mortal life and achievements. The Gilgamesh epic is sophisticated literature by any standard, exploring profound themes: friendship and loss, the relationship between civilization and nature, the human desire for immortality, the meaning of heroism, the proper relationship between humans and gods. The text displays literary techniques that would be recognized by any creative writing teacher: vivid imagery, compelling characters, dramatic structure, symbolic imagery, and philosophical depth. That such a complex literary work emerges so early in human history, composed when writing itself is barely 1,500 years old, testifies to the sophistication of Mesopotamian culture. Other literary works include myths explaining the origins of the cosmos, the nature of the gods, and humanity's place in creation. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes how the god Marduk defeats the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and creates the ordered world from her corpse. Humans are created to serve the gods, relieving the divine beings of the burden of labor. This is theology, but also political ideology, justifying both the social hierarchy that places kings above commoners and the religious system that demands service to the gods. Wisdom literature collects proverbs, moral advice, and philosophical reflections. One famous text, The Advice of Shuruppak, claims to preserve the wisdom of an antediluvian sage advising his son about proper conduct. The advice is practical and sometimes cynical. Don't buy a donkey that brays. It will split your midriff. Don't marry a prostitute. She will only bring you trouble. Don't reveal your innermost thoughts, even to your best friend. This is folk wisdom, preserved and transmitted through writing, providing guidance for navigating social life and avoiding trouble. Mathematical texts reveal impressive sophistication. Babylonian mathematicians work with a sexagesimal base 60 number system, develop sophisticated algebraic techniques, solve quadratic equations, calculate areas and volumes of complex geometric figures, and work with astronomical calculations requiring large numbers and precise fractions. Mathematical problem texts survive that would challenge modern students, calculating the dimensions of squares and rectangles given their areas and perimeters, determining the height of ladders leaning against walls, dividing inheritance fairly among heirs. The methods are practical, developed for real-world applications in surveying, architecture, commerce, and administration, but they display abstract mathematical thinking. Medical texts combine empirical observation with magical thinking. They describe symptoms of various diseases, provide recipes for medicines using various plants and minerals, and recommend procedures for treating injuries. But they also include incantations to drive out demons believed to cause illness, and diagnostic texts that interpret symptoms as messages from gods. A patient's symptoms might indicate divine anger requiring propitiation, demonic possession requiring exorcism, or natural illness requiring medication. The physician-priest addresses all possibilities, hedging his bets in a world where the causes of disease are mysterious and frightening. Astronomical texts become increasingly sophisticated over millennia. Priests carefully observe and record celestial phenomena, the positions of planets, the phases of the moon, eclipses, unusual events like comets or shooting stars. Initially motivated by religious concerns, the heavens are where gods dwell and send signs. These observations gradually become more systematic. By the first millennium BCE, Babylonian astronomers can predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy, track planetary movements, and develop mathematical models of celestial mechanics. This knowledge will later flow westward, influencing Greek astronomy and eventually the development of modern science. The preservation and transmission of all this knowledge depends on libraries. Major temples and palaces maintain libraries, collections of thousands of tablets organized by topic and catalog. The library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BCE, contains over 30,000 tablets, including literature, scientific texts, religious material, administrative records, and historical documents. Ashurbanipal boasts in inscriptions that he personally can read the complicated cuneiform script, a rare skill for a king. His library attempts to collect the wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization, creating an archive that will preserve this knowledge until modern archaeologists excavate the ruins 26 centuries later. The tablets themselves, clay inscribed with cuneiform and baked hard, prove remarkably durable. Unlike papyrus, which decays in damp conditions, or even parchment, which can burn or rot, clay tablets survive burial remarkably well. This is fortunate for modern scholars because tens of thousands of tablets have been excavated, providing an incomparable window into ancient Mesopotamian life. We can read the grocery lists of ordinary households, the mathematical exercises of students, the letters of merchants, the royal propaganda of conquerors, the prayers of priests, the love poems of ancient singers. No other ancient civilization is so well documented. Yet literacy remains restricted to a small elite. The vast majority of Mesopotamians, farmers, laborers, servants, slaves, cannot read or write. They depend on professional scribes for any interaction with the written world. When a farmer needs a legal contract, he hires a scribe. When a merchant receives a letter, he has it read aloud. The written culture exists alongside and above an oral culture that remains primary for most people. Stories are told and retold, songs are sung, traditions are passed down through performance and memory. Writing supplements but doesn't replace oral culture. The invention of writing creates new forms of power and inequality. Those who control writing control knowledge, records, law. The temple and palace bureaucracies, staffed by literate scribes, can organize society in unprecedented ways, tracking resources, enforcing obligations, maintaining control. Writing enables the state to extend its reach, to make subjects more legible and manageable. But writing also creates tools of resistance and empowerment. Legal contracts protect property rights. Written law codes limit arbitrary authority. Recorded accounts can expose corruption. The technology is powerful, and like all powerful technologies, it can serve multiple purposes. Writing also transforms human cognition and culture in subtle but profound ways. The ability to externalize thought onto clay tablets allows for more complex reasoning, because ideas can be manipulated, rearranged, compared, and refined in ways that purely mental thought cannot achieve. Lists, tables, and systematic organization of knowledge become possible. Logical argumentation develops because written texts can be examined, critiqued, and debated in ways that spoken words, vanishing as soon as uttered, cannot be. The very structure of thought changes when ideas can be fixed in writing. The long-term influence of Mesopotamian writing is difficult to overestimate. Cuneiform itself spreads throughout the ancient Near East, adapted to write multiple languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Elamite, Hurrian, and others. The administrative techniques, the legal concepts, the literary forms developed in Mesopotamia influenced later civilizations. The alphabet, invented by Phoenicians around 1200 BCE, probably draws inspiration from seeing cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, though it takes writing in a radically new direction with purely phonetic representation. That alphabet eventually evolves into Greek, Latin, and all modern European writing systems. The content of Mesopotamian literature flows westward as well. The Epic of Gilgamesh influences later epics, including possibly Homer's works. The Mesopotamian flood story appears in Gilgamesh and other texts, later influencing the biblical account of Noah. Mesopotamian legal concepts inform biblical law. Mesopotamian myths and religious ideas spread throughout the ancient world. adapting and transforming but carrying traces of their Mesopotamian origins. The wisdom literature influences later proverb collections in multiple cultures. Even the structure of scholarly knowledge organized into lists, categories, and systematic treatments shows Mesopotamian influence. Writing begins as simple accounting, marks in clay to track sheep and grain. It evolves into the vehicle for humanity's first great literature, its first systematic science, its first comprehensive law codes, its first self-conscious historical records. The Mesopotamians invent writing to solve practical problems of economic management, but in doing so, they create a tool that transforms human civilization. The word, once captured in clay, becomes permanent, authoritative, powerful. The scribes who master this technology become essential intermediaries between the present and the past, between the powerful and the powerless, between the human and the divine. The written word is perhaps Mesopotamia's most lasting gift to world civilization, and we are still, in many ways, living within the revolution it began. Chapter 8. Gods, Temples, and Cosmic Order. Religion permeates every aspect of Mesopotamian life, shaping how people understand the world, organize their societies, and imagine their place in the cosmos. The cities themselves are fundamentally religious creations, each one the earthly estate of a particular god or goddess, with the inhabitants existing primarily to serve the divine landlord. Understanding Mesopotamian civilization requires understanding its religious worldview, which is complex, sophisticated, and in many ways deeply alien to modern secular thinking. The Mesopotamian cosmos is full of gods, hundreds or even thousands of them, arranged in a loose hierarchy. At the top are the great gods of cosmic forces, and the sky god and father of the gods. Enlil, god of storm and wind and king of the gods in the Sumerian period. Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and magic. Inanna Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and the planet Venus. Below them are countless lesser deities presiding over cities, rivers, fields, crafts, and every aspect of natural and social life. Each profession has its patron god. Each city has its divine protector. Every force of nature is personified as a deity with personality, desires, and power. The gods are not transcendent, all-powerful, or purely benevolent in the Judeo-Christian sense. They are like humans, only more powerful, immortal, and dangerous. They have families, relationships, conflicts, and emotions. They get angry, jealous, proud, petty. They make mistakes. They can be bribed, flattered, or appeased. The relationship between humans and gods is transactional. Humans provide service, worship, and offerings, and gods provide protection, prosperity, and order. When things go wrong, crops fail, disease strikes, war comes, it's because the gods are displeased and must be propitiated. The temple is the god's house, literally understood as the deity's dwelling place on earth. The innermost sanctuary contains the cult statue, an image of the god made of precious materials, which is not merely a representation, but an actual locus of divine presence. The statue is treated as a living being. It's dressed in fine clothing, offered food and drink multiple times daily, entertained with music, and taken on ceremonial processions. The daily temple rituals are elaborate, with priests performing prescribed actions at prescribed times, maintaining the routines that keep the cosmos functioning properly. The temple staff is extensive and specialized. High priests and priestesses, often from elite families, oversee major rituals and temple administration. Below them are various ranks of religious specialists, singers who perform hymns, musicians who play during ceremonies, diviners who interpret omens, exorcists who combat demons and evil magic, temple servants who handle daily operations, and numerous support staff. Some priestesses serve as sacred prostitutes, engaging in ritual sex as part of fertility cults, though this practice and its extent remain controversial among scholars. Other priestesses are celibate. dedicated entirely to divine service. The variety of religious roles reflects the complexity of Mesopotamian religious life. The temples own vast economic resources. Through a combination of direct ownership, royal grants, and donations from worshippers, the major temples control enormous tracts of agricultural land, herds of livestock, workshops, and skilled labor. This wealth supports not just religious activities, but also extensive economic operations. Temple institutions function as banks, making loans to farmers and merchants. They operate workshops producing textiles, beer, and craft goods. They store grain, serving as warehouses and emergency reserves during famines. The economic and religious functions are completely intertwined. There's no separation between sacred and secular administration. The priesthood develops sophisticated theological and mythological traditions, explaining the nature of reality and humanity as placed within it. The creation myths are particularly revealing. In one Sumerian account, the gods create humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, specifically to relieve the gods of labor. Humans are servants, created to work the gods' fields, maintain their temples, and provide offerings. This isn't a noble calling, but a form of divine enslavement, though one that gives human existence purpose and meaning within the cosmic order. The Babylonian creation epic, Enuma Elish, tells a different but related story. The younger gods, led by Marduk, battle the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat and her monstrous offspring. Marduk defeats Tiamat, splits her corpse to create heaven and earth, establishes cosmic order, and then creates humans from the blood of Tiamat's consort Kingu to serve the gods. The epic is read annually during the New Year festival in Babylon, reinforcing Marduk's supremacy and Babylon's special status. It's theology, politics, and entertainment combined, explaining both cosmic order and earthly hierarchy. The afterlife in Mesopotamian belief is grim and egalitarian. All the dead, regardless of status or virtue, descend to the underworld, called Urkala or Kor, a dark, dusty place where ghosts eat clay and drink dirty water. There's no heaven or hell in the moral sense, no reward for virtue or punishment for vice in the afterlife. A few exceptional individuals, Gilgamesh, Ziusudra, the flood hero, achieve some form of immortality, but for ordinary mortals, death is the end of meaningful existence. This belief system places enormous emphasis on achieving lasting fame and accomplishment in this life, since nothing awaits beyond death except shadowy existence. The exception to this dreary fate is proper burial and continued offerings from descendants. The dead need food and drink offerings from the living to avoid becoming hungry, angry ghosts who plague their surviving relatives. Funerary rituals and ancestor worship are important, with regular offerings made at family tombs. To die without descendants who will maintain these offerings is a terrible fate. One of the motivations for the importance placed on having children, particularly sons. Magic and divination are integral to Mesopotamian religion, not separate or opposed to it. The universe is full of signs sent by the gods, and those with proper training can interpret them. Divination takes many forms. Haruspicy, examination of animal livers, is particularly important. A sheep is sacrificed, and the divine will is read in the shape, color, and markings of its liver. Oil divination interprets patterns formed when oil is dropped into water. Astrology observes celestial phenomena, with unusual events in the sky presaging unusual events on Earth. Dream interpretation reveals divine messages sent during sleep. Even everyday occurrences encountering certain animals, observing weather patterns, noticing architectural features can be ominous if properly interpreted. Extensive omen texts compile observations linking signs with subsequent events. If the liver is shaped thus, the king will triumph. If Mars appears in this position, there will be war. If a man encounters a white dog on his right, he will prosper. This is proto-science in a way. systematic observation attempting to find predictable patterns in nature. The underlying assumption that the gods control events and send signs is wrong from a modern perspective, but the method of careful observation, record-keeping, and pattern recognition is fundamentally scientific. Magic is used for both helpful and harmful purposes. Protective magic guards against demons, evil spirits, and hostile magic from enemies. Incantations, amulets, and rituals create protective barriers around individuals, houses, and cities. Healing magic combats disease, often conceptualized as caused by demons or divine anger. Love magic attempts to attract or bind romantic partners. Curse tablets call down divine wrath on enemies. The line between religion and magic is blurry, with many of the same practitioners, priests performing both. The main distinction seems to be that religion is public, communal, and sanctioned, while magic is often private, individual, and sometimes suspect. The great religious festivals structure the year and bring communities together. The New Year festival, celebrated in spring, is the most important, lasting 12 days and involving elaborate rituals. Processions through city streets, reenactments of creation myths, ritual combats symbolizing cosmic order, triumphing over chaos, sacred marriages between gods, feasting and entertainment. The king plays a central ritual role, receiving his mandate from the god, sometimes undergoing ritual humiliation and restoration to symbolize renewal. These festivals reinforce social cohesion, display divine favor, and legitimize political authority. Personal religion coexists with the grand public rituals. Ordinary people have personal deities, usually minor gods who function almost like guardian angels, protecting individuals and interceding with greater gods on their behalf. People pray to these personal gods, make offerings at household shrines, and seek their guidance in daily matters. Thousands of personal names incorporate divine elements, reflecting hopes that the named god will protect the child. Shamash Yukin. Shamash has established a name, Ishtar el-Anisha. Ishtar is my goddess, and countless others. Religious tolerance is generally high by modern standards. Each city respects the gods of other cities, even while asserting its own god's superiority. When one city conquers another, the conquerors typically honor the defeated city's gods, make offerings at their temples, and claim divine approval for their rule. The gods themselves are understood to be real, powerful, and deserving of respect, even enemy gods. The concept of religious war fighting to destroy another people's false gods is largely absent. Wars are fought for political and economic reasons, with religious justifications added, but the gods on both sides are acknowledged as real and powerful. The mythology is rich, complex, and multivalent. The descent of Inanna tells of the goddess's journey to the underworld to challenge her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Inanna is stripped of power, killed, and hung on a hook, causing fertility to cease in the world above. Only through the cleverness of Enki and the sacrifice of Inanna's consort, Dumuzi, is she freed, but Dumuzi must spend half the year in the underworld. The myth can be read as explaining seasonal cycles, exploring death and resurrection, examining power relationships between female deities, or mediating on the price of divine ambition. Like all great myths, it works on multiple levels. The relationship between religion and state evolves over Mesopotamian history. In the early Sumerian period, the temple and city are nearly identical, with the NC serving as both religious and political leader. As kingship develops, secular authority grows stronger, sometimes in tension with priestly authority. Kings claim divine selection and sanction, but also assert independent power. Some rulers, like the Akkadian kings, claim divine status. Others, like Hammurabi, present themselves as pious servants executing divine will. The balance shifts over time and varies by period and place, but religion always remains central to political legitimacy. The theological sophistication sometimes reaches impressive philosophical depths. Some texts question divine justice, noting that the righteous sometimes suffer while the wicked prosper. The Babylonian Theodicy, a wisdom poem, explores why the gods allow injustice, why human existence involves such suffering, why piety doesn't guarantee reward. The answer is unsatisfying humans cannot understand divine purposes, so we must accept what comes, but the questioning itself reveals philosophical engagement with profound moral problems. The religious worldview ultimately shapes everything in Mesopotamian civilization. The organization of cities around temples, the economic systems that support elaborate cults, the art and architecture glorifying the gods, the literature preserving myths and hymns, the law codes claiming divine authority, even the irrigation systems conceptualized as gifts from benevolent gods making the land fertile. To understand Mesopotamian civilization, one must understand that for these people, the gods are real, present, powerful, and intimately involved in every aspect of life. The cities are built by humans, certainly, but always for divine purposes, always as places where gods and humans interact, where the cosmic order is maintained through proper ritual, where civilization itself is understood as a divine gift requiring constant maintenance through worship, sacrifice, and service. Chapter 9. The merchants and the trade routes. While priests chant in temples and kings wage wars, another group quietly builds networks that connect Mesopotamian cities to the wider world: the merchants. Long-distance trade is essential to Mesopotamian civilization because the alluvial plains lack many basic resources. There's no stone for construction or tools, no timber for buildings or ships, no metals for tools or weapons, no precious stones for jewelry or decoration. Everything beyond mud, reeds, and agricultural products must be imported. This necessity drives the development of sophisticated trade networks stretching thousands of kilometers, creating an interconnected world of commercial exchange that makes the cities possible. The pattern begins early, even before true urbanization. The obsidian found in 6th millennium BCE sites in southern Mesopotamia comes from Anatolian quarries over 800 kilometers away. Lapis lazuli beads in 4th millennium burials originate in the mountains of Afghanistan, nearly 3,000 kilometers distant. These materials don't travel through simple hand-to-hand exchange. The distances are too great, the logistics too complex. Specialized traders, the ancestors of Mesopotamia's merchant class, are already operating, creating networks that move goods across vast distances and through multiple intermediaries. By the early dynastic period, 3rd millennium BCE, professional merchants are well established. They operate from both temple institutions and as private entrepreneurs. The Sumerian term damgar denotes a merchant, typically someone of substantial wealth and status who organizes trading expeditions, finances commercial ventures, and manages networks of agents in distant locations. The merchant's business requires considerable capital, purchasing goods for export, outfitting expeditions, hiring guards and porters, feeding and housing traders during long journeys. Only wealthy individuals or institutions can participate at this level. The export goods from Mesopotamia are primarily agricultural surplus and manufactured items: grain, dates, wool, textiles, leather goods, and high-quality craft products. Mesopotamian textiles are particularly prized throughout the ancient Near East, woven from abundant wool and often elaborately decorated. Mesopotamian cities also serve as manufacturing centers, importing raw materials, processing them, and re-exporting finished goods. Copper ore arrives from Oman, is smelted and cast into tools and weapons in Mesopotamian workshops, then traded onward. The import needs are diverse and urgent. Timber is essential for roof beams, door frames, and shipbuilding, but trees are scarce in southern Mesopotamia. Cedar from the Lebanese mountains is particularly prized, mentioned in texts with reverence, its acquisition celebrated in royal inscriptions and literary works. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero's expedition to the cedar forest as a great adventure, facing the monster Mubaba to cut cedar for Uruk's temple doors. The myth reflects the real difficulty and importance of timber acquisition. Stone is needed for everything from grinding grain to constructing temple foundations to carving statues. Diorite from the Persian Gulf region, basalt from Syrian quarries, limestone from various sources, all must be imported at considerable expense. The Great Law Stele of Hammurabi is carved from black basalt, probably quarried hundreds of kilometers from Babylon, then transported by river and road, shaped by skilled craftsmen, inscribed with thousands of cuneiform signs and erected in a prominent location. The stone itself is a display of wealth and reach. Metals are absolutely essential and completely absent from the southern plains. Copper comes primarily from Oman, called Megan in cuneiform texts, reached by sea routes through the Persian Gulf. Tin, necessary for making bronze, has more distant sources, possibly Afghanistan or Central Asian regions, reaching Mesopotamia through complex overland routes. Silver and gold come from Anatolia, Iran, or Egypt, depending on period and political circumstances. The metals trade is so important that metal ingots sometimes serve as currency, with standardized weights facilitating exchange. Precious and semi-precious stones satisfy the demand for jewelry, decorative objects, and cylinder seals. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan is especially valued. Its deep blue color associated with the heavens and with divine power. Carnelian from India, various agates, and other decorative stones travel along the same networks that move lapis. The presence of these exotic materials in Mesopotamian sites reveals the extent and efficiency of the trade networks. The routes themselves are varied and challenging. River transport on the Tigris and Euphrates is efficient for moving bulk goods within Mesopotamia, with boats ranging from small reed rafts to substantial wooden vessels. Going downstream is easy, but upstream requires rowing, sailing when wind permits, or towing from the bank. Overland routes use donkeys as pack animals in the 3rd millennium, with camels gradually adopted in the 2nd and 1st millennia. Caravans require organization, guards against bandits, knowledge of routes and water sources, and diplomatic arrangements with the various kingdoms and tribes through whose territories they pass. Sea trade develops through the Persian Gulf, connecting Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley civilization in modern Pakistan and India. The Kingdom of Doman, located on Bahrain Island, serves as an intermediary in Trepon, where Mesopotamian merchants meet traders bringing goods from the east. Excavations on Bahrain reveal clear evidence of this role. Mesopotamian cylinder seals, pottery typical of the Indus civilization, copper ingots from Oman, all mixed together in what was clearly an international trading center. Ships capable of these voyages are substantial, requiring skilled shipwrights, experienced sailors, and significant capital investment. The commercial relationships are formalized through contracts, partnerships, and credit arrangements. A typical transaction might involve a merchant advancing goods or silver to an agent who travels to a distant location, exchanges the goods for local products, and returns to share the profits. The contracts specify terms, how profits are divided, what happens if goods are lost or stolen, time limits for completion, penalties for breach. These commercial contracts, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, reveal a sophisticated understanding of business relationships, risk management, and legal protection of commerce. Credit is essential because journeys take months or years, and capital is tied up for long periods. Lending practices develop, with interest rates regulated by custom and sometimes by law. Hammurabi's law code specifies maximum interest rates: 20% for loans of silver, 33% for loans of grain. Higher rates are illegal, suggesting that predatory lending is a recognized problem. Merchants both borrow and lend, creating networks of financial obligation alongside networks of goods exchange. Women participate in commerce more than in many other aspects of Mesopotamian life. Merchant families often involve wives, daughters, and sisters in business operations, particularly when male family members are traveling. Some women operate as independent merchants, though they face legal and social constraints that men don't. The Natatu women, a class of priestesses who don't marry or bear children, often engage in business, managing properties, making loans, and participating in commercial transactions. Their religious status and independence from male household authority give them unusual freedom for economic activity. The merchant's life is risky, but potentially lucrative. Expeditions face dangers from weather, bandits, political instability, and simple bad luck. A merchant might invest everything in a trading venture only to have the caravan attacked, the ship sink, or the agent abscond with the goods. But successful ventures bring substantial profits, sometimes doubling or tripling the initial investment. Over time, successful merchant families accumulate considerable wealth, building large houses, acquiring land, and gaining social prestige. Trade also serves as a vector for cultural exchange. Along with goods, travel ideas, technologies, artistic styles, religious concepts, and social practices. The spread of cuneiform writing to non-Sumerian languages, the adoption of Mesopotamian cylinder seal styles by distant peoples, the influence of Mesopotamian art and architecture on neighboring civilizations, all these reflect contacts established and maintained through commerce. Merchants are not just traders, but cultural intermediaries, brokers between different worlds. By the 2nd millennium BCE, the trade networks have become so extensive and sophisticated that an international system develops. The great kingdoms of the age Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, Mitanni engage in regular diplomatic correspondence, arrange royal marriages, exchange gifts, and maintain commercial relationships. The Amarna letters diplomatic correspondence from 14th century Egypt reveal this system in detail. Kings addressing each other as brothers, negotiating marriage alliances, requesting specific gifts, including generous amounts of gold, complaining about inadequate gifts received, coordinating responses to common threats. It's a world system with Mesopotamian commercial expertise and diplomatic practices forming part of its foundation. The merchants themselves leave limited direct testimony. Unlike kings who commission inscriptions praising their deeds, or priests who record religious texts, merchants produce mostly mundane business records. But occasionally, personality breaks through. A letter might include a complaint about a dishonest partner, a celebration of a particularly profitable venture, a worry about family members, a request for a personal favor. These glimpses reveal the human beings behind the commercial transactions, people who spend years away from home in pursuit of profit, who take enormous risks, who build relationships across cultural boundaries, who create the commercial networks that make urban civilization possible. Without the merchants and their trading networks, the Mesopotamian cities could not exist in their developed form. The lack of local resources would be crippling. The trade networks supply essential materials, connect Mesopotamia to the wider world, spread Mesopotamian influence far beyond its borders, and create wealth that supports the elaborate urban culture. The merchants are not the most celebrated figures in Mesopotamian civilization. That honor goes to kings, priests, and literary heroes, but they are among the most essential, the quiet architects of an interconnected ancient world. The story of how the ancient Mesopotamians built the world's first cities is ultimately a story about human ambition, ingenuity, and adaptation. Over 6,000 years, people in the land between the rivers transformed themselves from mobile hunter-gatherers into urban dwellers, creating in the process virtually every fundamental institution and technology that defines civilization: agriculture, irrigation, writing, law, literature, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, complex religion, professional armies, and systematic government. The achievement is all the more remarkable because it occurred in a challenging environment. The Mesopotamian plains are hot, dry, and lacking in basic resources. The rivers flood unpredictably and dangerously. There is no stone, little timber, and no metal. Yet the Mesopotamians not only survived but thrived, building cities that housed tens of thousands of people, empires that spanned from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, and a cultural tradition that lasted for over 3,000 years. The key to understanding this achievement lies in recognizing the interconnected nature of Mesopotamian innovations. Irrigation made agricultural surplus possible, but irrigation required coordinated labor, which required organization, which led to hierarchy and eventually to kingship and temples. Writing developed to manage economic complexity, but once invented, writing enabled law, literature, science, and history. Trade networks brought essential resources, but maintaining those networks required diplomatic relations, military protection, and financial instruments. Each innovation enabled others, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of increasing complexity and capability. The Mesopotamians succeeded in building the world's first cities, but they also experienced the limitations and costs of their success. Environmental degradation from intensive irrigation, social inequality creating permanent underclasses, military competition generating endless warfare, bureaucratic rigidity stifling innovation. These problems plagued Mesopotamian civilization throughout its history and eventually contributed to its decline. Modern urban civilization faces analogous challenges, and we might learn from both Mesopotamian successes and failures. The most profound legacy may be simply the demonstration that cities are possible, that humans can organize themselves into complex urban societies, that civilization can be built and maintained across generations. The Mesopotamians proved this first, creating out of mud and water, ambition and organization, faith and force, the world's first cities. Every city built since then, including the one you may be reading this in, stands on foundations laid in ancient Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where humans first dared to imagine urban life and then made that imagination real.